worst winter of Graham Wilder's life began less than an hour after he lost the only place he had left to call home. The front door closed behind him with a quiet click, but to Graham it sounded louder than any storm he had ever faced. At 68 years old, the former Navy SEAL stood on the frozen porch of the family ranch with a worn backpack slung over one shoulder and a German Shepherd at his side. That was all he had left. No savings worth mentioning, no property, no family willing to stand beside him. Just Huron, the dog who had followed him through years of hardship without ever asking for anything in return. The late December wind swept across the Montana Valley, carrying loose snow through the empty fields. Graham stood motionless for a moment, staring at the house, where he had spent most of his life. Warm light glowed through the windows. Shadows moved inside. Life continued, as though he had never existed there at all. He slowly turned away. Huron pressed against his leg and looked up at him with alert amber eyes. The dog seemed to understand that something important had ended. Graham reached down and rested a hand on the thick fur around Huron's neck. "Looks like it's just us now, partner," he said quietly. Huron's tail moved once. That was enough. Together they stepped off the porch and onto the snow-covered road leading away from the ranch. The sky overhead had already darkened into a deep steel gray. Weather forecasts had been warning about a major winter system moving down from Canada. But Graham had paid little attention. He had faced rough conditions before. Years of military service had taught him how to endure discomfort. Yet something about the air felt different tonight. Colder, heavier, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The road stretched ahead through miles of open land. Graham had no destination. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. He considered heading there, but the thought of crowded shelters and sympathetic stares made his stomach tighten. Instead, he turned toward the distant foothills, rising beyond the valley. At least the mountains offered solitude. Huron walked slightly ahead, his ears constantly moving. As he listened to sounds hidden within the growing wind, every few minutes the dog glanced back to make sure Graham was still following. The temperature continued to fall. Snowflakes drifted from the darkening sky. At first, they came slowly, almost peacefully. Then they became thicker. The wind strengthened. Graham adjusted the straps of his backpack and pulled his old coat tighter around his chest. Far away, beyond the ridges, a low rumble echoed through the mountains. It wasn't thunder. It was something else. The sound of a massive storm approaching. Huron suddenly stopped walking. His body stiffened. His ears pointed toward the distant peaks. Graham followed the dog's gaze. Across the horizon, a wall of white was beginning to swallow the mountains one ridge at a time. The storm was arriving much faster than anyone had predicted. For several seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then Huron let out a single sharp bark and stared toward a narrow path, disappearing into the forest, as if he sensed something waiting there beyond the falling snow. Huron barked again and stepped onto the narrow trail leading into the forest. Snow swirled between the pine trees, already covering parts of the path. Graham stared at the dog for a moment. "That is not the way to town," he said. Huron looked back, gave a short whine, and took several more steps forward. The wind howled across the ridge behind them. Graham glanced toward the valley. The wall of white had grown larger. What had seemed distant only minutes ago was now racing across the mountainside. He exhaled slowly. "You have a reason for this, do you not?" Huron barked once. Graham shook his head and managed a tired smile. "You always were stubborn." He followed. The forest swallowed them almost immediately. Tall pines blocked some of the wind, but the air felt colder beneath the branches. Snow continued falling harder with every passing minute. Huron moved with confidence, weaving through trees and frozen brush, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Graham struggled to keep pace. "Easy, boy," he called. "I am not 25 anymore." Huron slowed and waited. When Graham caught up, the dog nudged his hand before continuing forward. Nearly half an hour passed. The trail became rougher. Fallen logs and hidden rocks forced Graham to watch every step. The daylight faded behind thick clouds. A distant crack echoed somewhere high in the mountains. Graham stopped. "That does not sound good." Huron's ears lifted. The dog turned toward the sound, listening carefully before continuing forward. Graham followed, though uncertainty crept into his thoughts. He had spent years trusting instincts, both his own and those of working dogs. Still, something about this felt strange. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. "Because if this ends with me sleeping under a tree, I am filing a complaint." Huron ignored him. Another gust of wind swept through the forest. Snow blasted between the trunks like smoke. Graham pulled his collar higher. The temperature had dropped dramatically. His fingers were beginning to ache despite his gloves. Then Huron suddenly stopped. The dog lowered his head and sniffed the air. His body became rigid. Graham watched carefully. "What is it?" Huron moved several yards off the trail. He sniffed again, then looked back. Graham stepped closer. At first he saw nothing, then he noticed it. A faint smell carried through the freezing air. Wood smoke, very weak, almost gone, but it was there. Graham frowned. That cannot be right. There were no cabins marked anywhere near this section of the mountains. Most of the old hunting camps had been abandoned decades ago. Yet the scent remained. Huron barked excitedly and pushed deeper into the trees. Graham's pulse quickened. Shelter meant survival. Shelter meant warmth. Shelter meant hope. He followed as quickly as he could. The storm behind them continued advancing. Soon, visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. Snow covered their tracks almost immediately. The world became a blur of white and dark tree trunks. Graham stumbled once and caught himself against a pine. Huron immediately returned to his side. "I am fine," Graham said, breathing heavily. "Keep moving." The dog hesitated, then continued forward. Several minutes later, Huron froze again. This time he stared ahead into the storm. Graham stepped beside him and narrowed his eyes. At first, all he saw was snow. Then a dark shape slowly emerged between the swirling gusts. Massive, silent, unnatural. It stood hidden among the trees like something forgotten by time. Graham felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Huron," he whispered, "what exactly did you find?" The shape grew clearer as they moved closer through the blowing snow. It was not a cabin. It was much larger. Massive stone walls rose from the forest floor, partially hidden by decades of pine growth. The structure looked ancient, as if it had been standing there long before anyone in the valley could remember. Graham slowed. "There is no way this is on any map." Huron moved ahead, tail low but steady. The dog seemed focused on the building rather than afraid of it. Snow whipped around them in violent bursts now. The storm had fully arrived. Wind roared through the trees with a sound like distant freight trains. Graham could barely see more than 20 feet ahead. "We need to get inside," he said. "Right now." They crossed the final stretch of ground. The stone structure stood nearly 3 stories tall against the mountain slope. Parts of the roof were hidden beneath heavy snow. Thick vines and frozen branches clung to the walls. Graham ran a gloved hand across the stone. "Who built this place?" Huron suddenly barked and rushed toward the far side of the building. Graham followed. His boots slipped on ice hidden beneath the snow. He caught himself against the wall and continued moving. The dog stopped beside a narrow wooden door, reinforced with iron straps. Graham stared at it in disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me." The door looked intact, not new but maintained. Someone had repaired it at some point within the last several years. He grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing. He pulled harder. Still nothing. Locked. The wind struck his back with brutal force. Snow blasted across his face. Huron barked repeatedly and scratched at the bottom of the door. "I know," Graham said. "I know." He examined the frame. No keypad, no modern lock. Just old iron hardware covered in frost. He knocked loudly. Once, twice, 3 times, the sound vanished into the storm. No answers. Graham leaned his forehead against the cold wood. His breathing had become heavier. The temperature continued dropping. Even through years of training, he recognized the danger. They could not stay outside much longer. Huron whined and pressed against his leg. Graham looked down. "You picked a fine time to lead me to a locked building." Huron suddenly pulled away and ran around the corner. "Huron!" Graham followed immediately. The dog disappeared behind a cluster of snow-covered trees growing against the rear wall. When Graham reached him, Huron was digging furiously near the foundation. Snow scattered in every direction. "What are you doing?" Graham asked. The dog continued digging. Seconds later, part of the snow collapsed into a shallow depression. Graham stepped closer. Beneath the snow was stone. Not natural stone, a staircase. His eyes widened. "Well, I will be." Huron barked excitedly. Together they cleared more snow away, 1 step, then another, then another. The narrow staircase descended beneath the rear section of the structure. At the bottom sat a second entrance hidden completely from view. Unlike the main door, this one stood slightly open. A faint draft of warmer air drifted outward into the freezing night. Graham felt his pulse quicken. He slowly approached the opening. Huron stood beside him, staring into the darkness below. Then both of them heard it. A distant metallic sound echoed from somewhere deep inside the structure, as though a heavy object had just moved far beneath the mountain. The sound echoed through the hidden entrance, and then disappeared into silence. Graham and Huron remained perfectly still. Outside, the storm raged against the mountain, but down here everything felt strangely calm. "Tell me that was the wind," Graham muttered. Huron responded with a low rumble deep in his chest. "Yeah, I do not believe it either." He pulled a small flashlight from his backpack and switched it on. A narrow beam of light cut through the darkness. Stone walls stretched downward into a corridor disappearing beneath the structure. The air felt noticeably warmer than outside. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but warm enough to survive. Graham looked back toward the staircase. Snow was already drifting over the upper steps. Another hour outside would have been dangerous. "Looks like we do not have much choice, partner." Huron stepped forward first. Together they entered. The corridor sloped gently downward. Thick stone blocks lined both sides, covered with dust, but surprisingly well preserved. Graham moved carefully, scanning every corner. His military instincts remained sharp even after retirement. Somebody built this place for a reason. Their footsteps echoed softly. After nearly 50 yards, the passage opened into a large underground chamber. Graham stopped in disbelief. Good Lord! The room looked like an old mountain lodge hidden beneath the earth. A massive stone fireplace occupied one wall. Wooden shelves lined another. Several lanterns hung from hooks. A long table stood in the center, coated in a thin layer of dust. Yet something immediately caught Graham's attention. The place was not abandoned. Stacked beside the fireplace sat freshly cut firewood, not ancient wood, not rotten wood, fresh wood. Huron walked directly to the pile and sniffed it. "Exactly what I was thinking," Graham said. "Someone has been here." He moved deeper into the room. Blankets were folded neatly on a nearby shelf. Metal cookware hung above a small preparation counter. Several sealed containers sat against the far wall. Everything appeared organized, maintained, as though the owner had simply stepped away. Graham opened one container. Inside were emergency supplies, dried food, bottled water, medical items. He slowly shook his head. Whoever built this place planned ahead. Huron suddenly barked. Graham turned. The dog stood near the fireplace, staring at the stone wall behind it. "What is it?" Huron barked again and pawed at the floor. Graham approached. The flashlight beam revealed something unusual. The stone wall behind the fireplace looked slightly different from the surrounding masonry. The color did not quite match. Neither did the pattern. He ran his fingers across the surface. "That is strange." Huron continued staring at the wall. Then the dog moved closer and pressed his ear against the stone. Graham laughed softly despite everything. "You hear something?" Huron backed away and barked once more. Graham stepped forward. Curious, he placed his own ear against the wall. At first he heard nothing, then he froze. Somewhere beyond the stone came a faint sound. Not wind, not water. A rhythmic metallic clink repeating every few seconds. Graham slowly pulled back. His heartbeat quickened. There is a space behind this wall. The sound came again. Clink, clink, clink. Huron stared at him. Graham stared at the wall. Then his flashlight beam caught something almost invisible near the edge of the stonework. A rusted iron handle hidden beneath decades of dust. Graham brushed away the dust, covering the iron handle, and stared at it for several seconds. "Well, Huron," he said quietly, "either we found the luckiest shelter in Montana, or we just walked into the strangest place I have ever seen." Huron sat beside him, watching the wall with complete focus. The metallic sound came again from somewhere beyond the stone. Clink, clink, clink. Graham wrapped his gloved hand around the handle and pulled. Nothing happened. He tried again with more force. The mechanism groaned but refused to move. "Stubborn," he muttered. "You and this wall would get along." Huron wagged his tail once. Graham planted both feet firmly on the floor and pulled harder. A deep grinding sound echoed through the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling. Slowly, a section of the stone wall shifted inward. Cold air rushed from the opening. Graham immediately stepped back. Years of training had taught him patience. He waited, listened. Nothing moved inside. No voices, no footsteps, only silence. Huron approached first and sniffed the dark opening. "You are braver than I am," Graham said. The flashlight beam revealed a narrow passage hidden behind the wall. Unlike the main chamber, this corridor looked untouched. Thick dust covered the floor. Cobwebs stretched between the stone supports. Yet one thing stood out immediately. There were no footprints. Nobody had entered this passage for many years. Graham frowned. That does not make sense. The supplies outside were recent. The hidden corridor was ancient. The two facts did not belong together. Huron stepped into the passage. Graham followed. The corridor extended nearly 40 feet before ending at a heavy wooden door, reinforced with iron bands. The rhythmic metallic sound was louder now. Clink, clink, clink. Graham narrowed his eyes. It is coming from behind that door. He carefully turned the handle. This time it moved. The door swung inward with a long creak. The flashlight illuminated a circular stone room. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Old crates sat stacked in corners. A large wooden desk occupied the center. Everything was coated with dust except for one object. Hanging from a chain attached to the ceiling was a small brass lantern. It gently swayed back and forth. Clink, clink, clink. The chain struck a metal hook with each movement. Graham stared at it. That is impossible. There was no wind down here. Nothing should have been moving. Huron slowly entered the room. His nose moved from shelf to shelf. Graham approached the desk. Several old notebooks rested on top. Beside them sat a framed photograph. He picked it up carefully and wiped away the dust. The image showed 3 men standing beside the very stone structure above them. The photograph looked decades old. Graham's breath caught. One of the men seemed strangely familiar. He moved the flashlight closer. The face became clearer. Older style clothing, different era, but unmistakable. The man looked almost identical to his father. Graham slowly lowered himself into the chair behind the desk. "No," he whispered. "That cannot be." Huron suddenly barked sharply. Graham turned. The dog stood beside one of the shelves, staring at the lower corner. There, partially hidden behind several crates, was a small steel lockbox. Across its surface, someone had carved a single name. Graham stepped closer. The beam of his flashlight landed directly on the letters. Wilder. Graham stared at the name etched into the steel lockbox. For several seconds he could not move. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. "Wilder," he whispered. "That is impossible." Huron sat beside the box, watching him closely. Graham slowly knelt and brushed away more dust. The letters were old but clear. Someone had carved them carefully, deliberately. This was not an accident. This box belonged to his family. The question was why it had been hidden beneath a mountain. "You brought me here for a reason, did not you?" he asked quietly. Huron tilted his head. Graham reached for the latch. To his surprise, it was not locked. The lid opened with a soft metallic creak. Inside sat a bundle of yellow lint tied together with document leather cord. Beneath them rested a weathered journal. Graham carefully lifted the journal first. The leather cover cracked slightly as he opened it. On the first page, written in faded ink, were 3 words: "Property of Samuel Wilder." Graham froze. Samuel Wilder was his grandfather, a man he had barely known before the old rancher passed away decades earlier. Graham slowly sat down in the dusty chair beside the desk. "What were you hiding up here?" he murmured. Huron lay down beside him while he turned the pages. The handwriting described mountain surveys, weather observations, supply inventories, and construction notes. Page after page documented work performed around the stone structure. Graham continued reading until one entry caught his attention. The date was nearly 40 years old. His grandfather had written only a single sentence across the page: "If anything happens to me, Graham's father must never trust Richard." Graham immediately sat upright. Richard, his great-uncle Richard Wilder, the same relative who had managed much of the family's land years ago. Now that is interesting. He turned more pages. The entries became increasingly concerned. References appeared to legal disputes, missing records, and ownership claims. Several pages had been removed entirely, torn out. Huron suddenly lifted his head. The dog stood and walked toward another shelf at the far end of the room. "What now?" Graham followed him. Huron stopped beside a row of metal filing drawers built into the stone wall. One drawer sat slightly open. Graham pulled it wider. Inside were dozens of rolled maps secured with cloth bands. He selected one and carefully spread it across the desk. The map showed the entire valley. His eyes widened. The ranch, the mountain, the forests. Everything was marked in remarkable detail. Then he noticed something strange. A large section of land surrounding the mountain had been outlined in red ink. Graham leaned closer. According to the survey markings, the property boundaries extended far beyond the ranch he had grown up on, much farther, hundreds of acres farther. "No way," he whispered. Huron let out a low sound. Graham followed the dog's gaze toward a handwritten note attached to the corner of the map. The paper contained only one sentence. "If you are reading this, the truth was finally found before they could destroy it." Graham read the sentence 3 times before lowering the note. The room felt quieter than before. Even the soft, metallic clink from the lantern had stopped. Huron remained beside the desk, watching him carefully. "Destroy what?" Graham asked aloud. "And who is they?" He turned back to the map and studied the red boundary lines. The acreage was enormous. Forest land, mineral rights, water access, mountain sections that stretched far beyond anything he remembered from family records. Investors shook their heads. None of it matched property descriptions his father had shown him when he was young. Graham opened another drawer and found a stack of legal documents tied together with faded blue ribbon. He untied them and began reading. Within minutes, his expression changed. "You have got to be kidding me." The first document was an original survey, filed decades earlier. The second was a revised survey, submitted years later. The property lines were different, significantly different. Thousands of feet of mountain land had disappeared from the official records. Graham compared the signatures. One name appeared repeatedly: Richard Wilder, his great-uncle, the same man his grandfather had warned about in the journal. Huron suddenly stood and walked toward the far wall again. "What did you find now?" Graham asked. The German shepherd stopped beneath an old wooden shelf and stared upward. Graham raised the flashlight. A small metal tube rested behind several books. He reached up and pulled it free. Inside was a rolled letter sealed in wax. His heartbeat quickened. The seal carried the Wilder family brand. Carefully, he opened it. The letter was addressed to his father. Graham sat down and began reading. As the words unfolded across the page, pieces of a forgotten story began falling into place. Years ago, Samuel Wilder had discovered valuable mineral deposits beneath the mountain. Not gold, not silver. Something even more valuable to the companies expanding across the region at the time. Samuel had intended the land to remain with future generations of the family. But shortly before legal ownership could be finalized, documents vanished. Surveys changed. Boundaries shifted. Control quietly passed into other hands. Graham looked up from the letter. Someone stole it. The realization settled heavily over the room. Huron rested his head against Graham's knee. Graham scratched behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly. "My father knew," he said quietly. "That is why he never trusted certain people." He continued reading until the final paragraph. Then he froze. The letter ended with a warning. "If this message is ever found, there is one final record hidden beyond the archive room. It contains everything, every signature, every transaction, every name involved." Graham lowered the paper. "Archive room?" he whispered. He had already searched most of the chamber. There was no archive room. Huron suddenly barked once. Graham turned. The dog stood beside the stone wall near the filing cabinets, his nose pressed against a narrow crack between 2 blocks. Graham approached slowly. Then he noticed something he had missed before. A faint current of air was flowing through the crack. Cold air coming from somewhere deeper inside the mountain. The cold draft flowing through the crack was impossible to ignore. Graham ran his fingers along the stone blocks until he felt a small depression hidden in the mortar. He pressed it. A dull click echoed through the wall. Huron immediately stepped back. Slowly, a narrow section of stone shifted inward. Dust drifted into the air as a concealed doorway revealed itself. Graham let out a low whistle. "You keep finding things nobody else could find, buddy." Huron wagged his tail once and moved through the opening. Beyond the hidden door was a smaller chamber carved directly into the mountain. Unlike the rooms they had already explored, this one was immaculate. The shelves were organized. The boxes were labeled. Every document appeared protected, inside sealed metal containers. It looked less like a hiding place and more like a vault built for preserving evidence. Graham approached the nearest cabinet and opened it. Inside sat dozens of folders arranged by year. He selected one at random and spread the contents across a wooden table. Within minutes, his eyes widened. Land transfers, survey modifications, property adjustments. Every document traced the same pattern. Valuable sections of Wilder land had been quietly reassigned over many years through legal maneuvers that most people would never notice. "This was planned," Graham said quietly. "Not one mistake, not one accident." Huron rested beside the table while Graham continued reading. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. His grandfather had discovered the deception. His father had tried to stop it. Neither had succeeded. Then Graham found the final container. Unlike the others, it carried a handwritten label. Original ownership records. His pulse quickened. He opened it carefully. Inside were notarized surveys, witness statements, and original deeds. The signatures matched. The dates matched. Every missing piece suddenly fell into place. The mountain property, the surrounding acreage, and the mineral rights had never legally left the Wilder family. The documents proved everything. Graham leaned back slowly. "You know what this means?" Huron looked up. "It means my grandfather was telling the truth. My father was telling the truth. They were never the problem." He stared at the evidence spread across the table. For years he had believed the family stories were nothing more than bitterness left behind by old disputes. Now the truth sat in front of him, documented, verified, undeniable. Then something caught his attention. Beneath the final deed rested a sealed envelope addressed directly to him. Not to his father, not to a future heir, to Graham Wilder. His breath caught. "How could they know?" he whispered. The envelope appeared decades old, yet his name was written clearly across the front. He carefully opened it and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather. Graham read silently while Huron watched. The letter explained everything. Samuel Wilder had believed that one day Graham would return because he possessed the same determination as the generations before him. The final paragraph was short. "If you are reading this, then the mountain protected the truth long enough. Trust the dog. Finish what we could not." Graham lowered the paper. For a moment, he simply sat there in silence. Then Huron suddenly lifted his head and barked sharply toward the hidden doorway. Graham stood immediately. Footsteps were echoing somewhere beyond the chamber. The footsteps grew louder for several seconds before suddenly stopping. Graham remained still, listening. Huron stood between him and the doorway, ears forward, every muscle alert. Then the sound came again. Not footsteps, water, a steady drip echoing through the hidden corridors beyond the chamber. Graham let out a slow breath and lowered the flashlight. "You nearly gave me a heart attack, partner." Huron relaxed slightly, but remained watchful. The storm continued outside for the rest of the night. Graham gathered every document, map, survey, and letter he could find, and carefully packed them into waterproof containers stored inside the archive room. By dawn, he had assembled enough evidence to prove what had happened to his family. More importantly, he had proof of who truly owned the mountain and the surrounding land. When morning arrived, sunlight filtered through cracks in the upper structure. The blizzard had finally passed. Graham and Huron climbed out of the hidden shelter and stepped into a transformed world. Fresh snow covered everything. The forest sparkled beneath a clear blue Montana skies. Graham looked back at the stone structure rising from the mountainside. "You kept the truth safe all these years," he said quietly. A week later, he walked into a law office carrying 2 heavy cases filled with documents. The attorney spent hours reviewing the records. Finally, the older man removed his glasses and stared across the desk. "Mr. Wilder, if these documents are authentic, this changes everything." Graham nodded. "They are authentic." The attorney slowly smiled. "Then your family has a very strong claim. Months passed. Surveys were verified. Records were examined. Witness statements hidden within the archive room matched county archives. One by one, the missing pieces fell into place. The truth that had been buried beneath the mountain for decades could no longer be. Eventually, the ruling arrived. Original ownership rights were restored. The mountain property, the surrounding acreage, and valuable mineral rights legally belonged to the Wilder family. trust exactly as Samuel Wilder had intended. Graham stood quietly outside the courthouse holding the final documents. Huron sat beside him. Looks like Grandpa got the last word after all. Huron barked once. Graham laughed. Yeah, I think he would have enjoyed that. But the greatest surprise came later. Independent evaluations revealed the value of the land was far greater than anyone expected. Yet Graham never sold it. Instead, he returned to the mountain. The stone structure was restored carefully. The hidden rooms were preserved. The archive became a small museum dedicated to local history and the Wilder family story. The underground shelter was transformed into a safe refuge for hikers, ranchers, and veterans caught in severe winter storms. A bronze plaque near the entrance carried a simple inscription: "Truth survives." Years later, visitors often asked Graham how he had discovered the forgotten place. He always gave the same answer. He would smile, look toward Huron, and say, "I did not find it. He did." The German Shepherd became something of a local legend. Children brought treats whenever they visited. Travelers stopped to take photographs with him. Graham made sure everyone knew who deserved the credit. One quiet spring evening, Graham sat on a bench overlooking the valley, while the setting sun painted the mountains gold. Huron rested beside him. The air was warm, the snow was gone. Peace had finally returned. Graham looked across the land that had nearly been lost forever, and gently scratched behind Huron's ears. Not bad for two fellows who had nowhere left to go. Huron leaned against his leg. Together they watched the last light settle across the mountain that had protected a family's truth, restored a man's dignity, and given both of them a future neither had expected to find. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might enjoy it too. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us your city and country in the comments. More heartfelt and unforgettable hero dog stories are already waiting for you. See you in the next one.